Hello, and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. What we're going to do today is look at different ways to defend against 1e4. So, how can black defend against 1e4? So, I would say the most natural way, and I think the way in which we start playing, is pawn e5. Now, this is a good move. It gets us space in the centre. Firstly, it's just copying. Gets us space in the centre, allows our bishop to come out, to prepare to castle. I'm not sure if it makes sense to say it's the best move, but it's a good move. And it's the one the engine wants. If we look at the engine, 94 moves deep is what Stockfish wants. So that must mean something. Um, Most common move is knight f3. There are other moves such as f4 or knight c3. Most common move to defend. We get into things like the Spanish game, the Italian game, the Scotch game. We can't cover them all here, but I think if you want to be world champion, e5 is a move you need to know. Well, if you go one square less, you go e6. What about that? Well, then what's natural is for white to go d4 and take the centre, and then what you've done is you've prepared d5. This is a French defence. So this is a solid and sensible opening played by many great players. White has a range of options here. White can defend the pawn with the knight, which is quite a maximalist move and often leads to very interesting games. I mean, every game's interesting, right? But knight d2 here, the Tarrasch, which is, I would say, a bit more solid. It doesn't allow bishop b4 for the pin because you can play c3 in this line. And then another fascinating one is pawn e5, the advance, which I play a lot as white, actually. Then this sort of thing happens, c5, c3, maybe knight c6, knight f3, queen b6. Basically, black is trying to win the d4 pawn. The trick for white is not to let the d4 pawn go. So the main line, a3. Actually, here you can play c4 to lock, but let's not look at that. Let's look at knight h6, b4, takes, takes. Then the knight gets to f5, and then just in time we play bishop b2 and defend d4. So there's different lines. I don't know why I favour the advanced variation. Basically, as black, the French is a solid and sensible line, often played by people who like the Queen's Gambit declined. The issue here is that the Queen's bishop gets blocked in by the e6 pawn, but you know, you find a way to get it out. What's interesting is there's an opening that's like the French, but doesn't quite have that disadvantage, which is the Caro-Kann. You play c6. When they play d4, you play d5. And again, white has a choice of playing e5, the advanced, or defending the pawn with the knight on c3, or even defending it on d2. I think actually knight d2 is slightly more accurate. Discuss. Because what's normally happening is black's taking, but sometimes I think after knight c3, if black goes g6, I think the knight's thought to be better on d2. Anyway, you can basically, what white tends to do is defend the pawn, but as one intelligent player said, this opening leaves black with no pawn weaknesses and no bad pieces. It just maybe gives white a bit of space, for instance, after e5. So the question is, why does black ever play the French? Well, I think what's nice about the French is it's more of a developing move, right? e6, you're already getting the king's bishop out, whereas after c6, you're not doing that so much. So we've done e5, e6, c6. We're going to do d6, which is the Pertz defense. So here, naturally, white goes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and then basically black has to get the king's bishop out. Now, actually, one way of doing it is this, which is the Philidor, which comes after e4, e5. That's completely valid. But another way, the true Pertz, is to go g6. Then after a move like knight f3, there are other moves, bishop g7, bishop e2, castles. You've sort of got a King's Indian type fianchetto on the king's side, but after e4. So this is for players who like an unbalanced game. I wouldn't say it's for absolute beginners. It's an interesting game. Black may get into some positional disadvantage in these lines. It's possible if you end up with a pawn on e5 that the bishop on g7 is a bit bad, but you know, as my friend Ian Bush says, the bishop usually finds a way out. So the Perts is for people who kind of want to win as black and who are prepared to play a complicated position. That's pawn d6. Pawn g6, the modern, has a lot of similar characteristics and it can often arrive at a Perts via transposition like this. So there are different versions of the modern, like when you play c6, they play knight f3, and then you play d5. It's a slightly different kind of modern, but basically the modern is certainly very related to the Perts. That's g6 on move 1. d5 on move 1 is fascinating. The Scandinavian. Now, this is beloved by club players. It breaks one of the fundamentals of rules of chess, the main line, because you take with the queen here. So you play pawn d5, e4, you play pawn d5, which is a Scandinavian. When they take, and they really need to take, because that's the best move, you take with the queen. Knight c3 kicks it around, but then the main line is to put the queen in a5, and actually it's pretty hard for white to gain an advantage. This is sound for black. I mean, white's a little bit better, and some players frown on it because you really shouldn't develop your queen this early. But, you know, Magnus Carlsen has played the Scandinavian quite a bit, and his sort of point is that black's structure's pretty sound. So if white doesn't do something quickly, then black can be absolutely fine, actually. Black can be absolutely fine. I mean, here's a line. This is a sort of main line. Okay, you can take with the g pawn or the queen. Must admit, I would tend to take with the queen, and so would Stockfish. So anyway, that's the Scandinavian. Now, it's important to say that black can also, here, when they take, black can also take, move the knight out and take back with the knight like this. You can't play c4 for reasons I won't bore you with, c6. Well, you can, but black has a strong gambit after c6, which I think basically revolves around controlling the d4 square. But basically, the sort of main line goes like this. So you capture with the knight. It's cute. I mean, it's interesting chess. What's great about the Scandinavian is black can force that line from move 1, unlike things like, say, the Petrov. You can't force the Petrov because after e4, e5, white might play f4, or you know, you can't insist on the Spanish because white might play the Italian. So what's great about the Scandinavian is you can force it on move 1. I'm saving till last the Sicilian. Actually, it's not quite last, but I'm saving till the end the Sicilian. Okay, we'll save it till last. Knight f6 is the Alekhine. This is another complex opening, a bit like the modern or the Perts, but it's even more modern because you allow this, e5, knight d5. You even allow this, c4, the knight's getting kicked all over the place. If you're smart, the knight doesn't get trapped. It looks a bit scary, doesn't it? The knight doesn't get trapped, but again, it creates complex positions, and black's concept is for white to overextend the centre and then for black to undermine it. And very often that happens. I mean, it's a good opening. Like this, maybe. Very often, particularly if white doesn't know what he or she's doing, black can achieve that and the white centre collapses. So again, it's, I would say, an opening for advanced players, the Alekhine, but an interesting opening. It's slightly frowned on theoretically, but it's very playable and top players can make it work. I mean, that's one of the great things about chess. There's such a variety of possible openings. Another one is just to play knight c6. I think it's called the Nimzovich defense, actually. Now, this is odd. I mean, it can transpose, for instance, like this. It can transpose back into main lines. Or even, say, after d4, if you play e5, they can play d5, but also they can play knight f3. So there's some transposition. That's the Scotch game. There's some transpositions possible. I suppose an example of a line that goes independently is, well, the main line is d5, e5, bishop f5, and you've sort of got a Caro-Kann type position, but the difference is that the knight is developed on c6, which looks a little bit unhelpful because it's blocking the c-pawn, but you can sort of make it work. And it's certainly defensible, and I think a bit less explored. The last opening against d4 is the Sicilian defense, and this is a special opening because often leads to very unbalanced positions, very complicated positions. Huge variety of theory is possible in this line. We did a previous video on how to play against the Sicilian, but an example line, there are so many Sicilian lines. An example line is this: white plays d4, so white trades the d pawn for the c pawn, which means that white has one less pawn in the centre, but white has more space. Black has the half open c file, so there's sort of these different advantages that don't quite balance. a6 is the main line, the Najdorf. And actually, you can play some aggressive lines here. Bishop g5 used to be the more popular line, and after e6, f4, there's a lot of theory. These days, even more popular is to play bishop e3, and actually the engines want to do this. In fact, strictly what the engines want to do is they want to play f3 to stop the repeating, because actually after bishop e3 you can repeat. You can attack it with the after bishop e3 you can attack it with the knight, and then when the bishop goes back, the bishop doesn't have to go back, but if it goes back you can then take the knight back and repeat. So what the engine wants to do is go f3, then when you go e5 it goes knight b3. When you go and move like bishop e6, it wants to go bishop e3. And what we're going to look at here is a sort of castling on opposite sides type situation, which is super exciting and somewhat typical of the Sicilian. There's lots of complex lines like this in the Sicilian. So, you know, black's attacking on the queen side, white's attacking on the king side. Who knows how this is going to end? Very interesting, not for the faint-hearted. But good if you want to win as black, or good if you're a really strong player as black, which is often means you want to win because you want to preserve your grading. Anyway, that is my summary of possible defences against d4. I hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you soon.